Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and here I have a sword which I've never owned an example of before, so I thought rather than just selling it or whatever, I will show it to you and I'll talk about it. And it's actually a relatively important type of sword in late 18th century and 19th century swords and antique swords, antique arms sphere, and that is the sword of the French Cuirassiers. Curassiers, I think is probably a better pronunciation. So what distinguishes the sword of the Cuirassier? Well, anybody who's played Mount and Blade Napoleonic Wars will know Cuirassiers. They're the guys that wear breastplates and helmets and ride especially large horses. And they were the heaviest of the heavy cavalry. They were really a leftover of armoured knights. If we go back to the 17th century, the original Cuirassiers often had an assortment of weapons. Different countries preferred different things, but the thing which distinguished them was the cuirass. Okay, so the cuirassier takes its name from the cuirass. The cuirass, the French word cuir, means leather actually, and originally the word cuirasse probably meant as something made of leather, but that's a whole different topic for a different video. But by the late medieval period, the word cuirasse had become pretty much universally used to describe a breast and back plate. Okay, so more rather than late medieval, more kind of, let's call it the Renaissance era. Okay, so by the Renaissance, a cuirassier was someone who wore armour, and of course by the Renaissance this was starting to become more and more unusual, because the majority of cavalry by this point were abandoning armour because of gunpowder weapons and economy and other factors as well. And again, that's yet another topic for another video. I have touched on this in previous videos, but why was armour abandoned? Well, for many, many reasons. Undoubtedly gunpowder is one of the main reasons, but it's not the only reason, and definitely some arms and armour books probably overstate that as a point. It is inevitably fair to say as well that armies for the most part got larger, so you need more soldiers doing different jobs, and for those reasons and many other reasons armour wearing became less common. So the cuirassier or cuirassier became a specialised type of very uber heavy, super heavy cavalry, and became, relatively speaking, unusual or less frequent on the battlefield than knights had been, or men-at-arms. Now, if we fast forward to the 18th century, only a few countries were still using cuirassiers. In fact, by the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was no longer using cuirassiers. We had light cavalry, heavy cavalry and dragoons. Dragoons theoretically were supposed to fight on foot and then move around on horse. In reality, in Britain, most dragoons actually just were light cavalry, maybe sometimes with a different type of firearm. Light cavalry or hussars were generally more reliant on their swords and were hit and run and more mobile, scouting. And heavy cavalry were supposed to be the biggest horses, not so fast moving but harder hitting because of the bigger horses, the bigger men, and in the case of cuirassiers because they had armour as well. Now, not to say that the armour they were wearing was bulletproof, it was not, certainly not by the Napoleonic period. It may stop a stray musket ball from a distance, from an angle, if you were lucky. It may occasionally stop a pistol ball, but at close range, probably not most of the time. I do know that some of the cuirassiers' breastplates were in fact pistol-proofed. This is what gives us the expression bulletproof, because you would have a dent, an indentation showing that the pistol ball had not penetrated it. And this was the proof. Proof means like a stamp. The bulletproof. But for the large part, from a musket, and of course remember pistols were relatively uncommon on the battlefield. Some cavalry carried pistols, some officers carried pistols, but generally speaking, if you were going to get hit by a projectile, it was either going to be a piece of shrapnel, and in fairness, the helmet and the breastplate may protect you from shrapnel if you're lucky, or a musket ball, and really most of the time a musket ball will go straight through a breastplate or a helmet of this period, or indeed of any period. But by the Napoleonic period, the French cuirassiers were still quite numerous and they were still quite famous and effective. Other nations did have cuirassiers. You find them in Austria, I believe, and I think the Prussians still had cuirassiers, and various other, I think the Russians still had cuirassiers. But generally speaking, they were the elite the elite guard. And so they were given a very special sword in France. Now this isn't quite a Napoleonic one. This is the model 1816. Now for anybody who knows history out there, you will know that the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. So this is actually just very slightly after. In fact, this example is dated to the 1820s. But this type of sword was in use by French Cuirassiers from 1816 right the way through to, you know, the Crimean War and beyond, and in fact even to the Franco-Prussian War. And they did have different models that came in, but by and large they all share some common features. Now, what are the common features of the French Cuirassier's sword? Well, the most recognisable thing is this big brass hilt. And it really is big. As a comparison, I'm just going to hold up a British 1821 pattern like cavalry officers hilt here. You can see they're about the same handle length, but the guard on the French Cuirassier's sword is whopping, is really, really big. Like amusingly so, if you're not used to it. And you'll notice it is actually more or less one-sided, which does create a little bit of a problem. Colonel Mary Mong, who wrote the Memoir on Swords, which you can buy, find on Google Books as well, actually, for free. He does talk about the problem of these types of guards being overbalanced on one side, and in fact Henry Wilkinson, John Latham of the Wilkinson Sword Company did also talk about the same issue later in the 1860s. But nevertheless, it's a characteristic. It offers a good level of hand protection. You've essentially got a large dish plate here with three branches at the side, and the fourth being the knuckle bow at the front, and that does provide a very good protection against cuts and actually pretty good against thrusts, because you've got this large circular plate, somewhat like a big beefy small sword guard, with the added branches on the side to protect from cuts, and the knuckle bow of course. The pommel design on the model 1816 is slightly different from the earlier versions. The earlier versions are a little bit shorter pommels and just they did a little bit of a different shape. The guard is relatively similar to the Cuirassier swords that went before, but hilt aside, the absolute defining feature of the French Cuirassier sword is the blade. Now, first of all, the blades are big, really, really big. Different models vary in length. Usually between about 37 and 39, sometimes up to 40 inches. They are really, really big. Now, for anybody who knows inches, so I don't have centimetres in hand at the moment, but for anybody who knows inches will know that a 39-inch blade is big for a cut and thrust sword, okay? It's kind of the length of lots of rapiers, actually. Lots of historical rapiers, which are pretty much the longest single-handed swords that saw widespread use. Lots of rapiers vary between about 37 and 45 inches. So this is in the middle, more or less, of historical rapier lengths. But it's not really like a rapier at all, because this blade is big and heavy and massive. So let's actually measure this thing. I seem to remember it's about 38, 39 inches. There we go. It is 38.5 inches. There we go. Oh, and let's see, for those of you who love the metric system, and I've got to say I quite like it for smaller things, 38.5 inches is 98 centimeters, more or less. Okay, so a 98 centimeter blade, and it is a big, big thing. You'll also notice that it's got these very characteristic double fullers up the blade. Now, the idea of this was to create a blade that was as long and stiff as possible, given the weight restraints. So, in other words, as light and as long and as stiff as they thought was possible. So it's it's exactly as you would imagine. The back is completely blunt, then there's of a certain thickness, then there's the same thickness in the middle, and then of course there's a degree of edge at the front. I'll talk about the edge in a minute. So this double fullered blade we see throughout the different models of Cuirassier sword, of the French Cuirassiers in the 19th century. And it was the defining feature, really, apart from that big massive three-branched hilt. It was the defining feature, this double fullered, very long, straight blade. And of course, this was intended to be a dedicated thrusting sword, but don't think of it in the same way as a small sword or a rapier. A small sword or a rapier is a sword that's intended to be able to fight with on foot. This is not. That's not to say you couldn't fight with this on foot, but it's really a cavalry weapon. It's an estoc, essentially. Okay, it's a skewer. And this is a relatively stiff, it's not insanely stiff, but it's a relatively stiff blade, given the length. And that's actually something that's worth talking about in its own right, is that the longer you make a blade, the more difficult it is to make it stiff without making it unwieldably heavy. And this is why if we look at estocs, and estocs are obviously designed for thrusting, but they're also designed to be long and stiff. And if you want something that's long and stiff, what cross-sectional shape is an estoc? Usually triangular or square. It's very, very difficult to even make a weapon that has edges on it and is as long and stiff as an estoc. You have to sacrifice something. And usually, with a rapier, for example, what gets sacrificed is a degree of stiffness and a degree of cutting capacity. Okay, so this is an estoc-like stiff thrusting sword that is big and heavy. But how heavy is it? Well, I've got my good old trashy plastic scales here, but they do the job. Incidentally, various people have recommended that I get some baggage scales, but the baggage scales that I've so far looked at are really for weighing heavier things than swords. But anyway, let's see how heavy this is. So it is around 3¼ pounds or 1450 grams. That's a heavy, heavy sword, okay? That's heavier than most large rapiers. It's heavier than the majority of medieval arming swords. It's heavier than almost all sabres, 19th century sabres anyway. And it's the weight of some lighter longswords, okay? This is a big, heavy sword. And you have to remember, a lot of the weight, of course, is in that big brass hilt at the back end, but nevertheless you're still dealing with a 38-inch blade as well. So this is a really, really big sword, and some people have said that you couldn't use these to fight with on foot and that they are simply cavalry skewers. Is that true? Well, we might do a little bit of experimentation in a minute just to see how it moves on foot. But the last thing I want to talk about before I do that is the edge. So this is just a side point really, but anybody who's played Mount and Blade Napoleonic Wars will indeed see that this sword is a very effective cutting weapon in that game. Is it in real life? Oh no, no, it's terribly, terribly not. The edge geometry on this is terrible. You could spend a lot of time making that edge as sharp as you can, but due to the edge geometry, this is always going to be a diabolically bad cutter. Really, really bad. It's got two problems. First of all, the edge is very... the angle at the edge is very wide, okay? Because you've got to remember, you've got two fullers. So the one before the edge has a very wide bevel just before you get to the edge. So that's the first problem. Secondly, it's very shallow. It doesn't have much bevel to that edge. So even if you ground down that entire bevel, you'd be left with probably about an 80-degree meeting of the planes. Over a very short distance. But the second problem is you've got this mid-rib and another rib behind it, so you've got a hell of a lot of friction. So if you chop any kind of target, not only is your edge going to be very poorly formed to get through it initially, but you've then got two ribs behind it to pass through. So essentially this is just a pretty much a useless cutter or chopper. But could it be useful for just whacking someone really hard with? Well, actually, yes. You've got to bear in mind, this is a 3¼ pound weapon. It's a bar of steel with a 38-inch blade. If you swing this really, really hard, it is going to have quite a lot of percussive effect. But if we look at what this weapon might have been going up against, so if we look at the British 1796 heavy cavalry Palash, which is primarily actually a cutting sword, it's essentially a broadsword, that will hugely, hugely outcut this. But of course it doesn't have such long reach as this. And these were used with the point. And there's this famous quote of Napoleon telling his cavalry, don't cut, only use the point. Well, with this sword, that is certainly what is intended, okay? But if you get into a melee, you can't always use the point, especially if you've got such a long blade. So really, horsemanship and passing through and past the enemy are going to be very, very important with this sword. And if you get into any kind of turning melee with this weapon, good luck to you. My money would, despite, you know, there's a good reason they've got breastplates and helmets, but my money would be on the people with the sabres or the palashes in close combat. Okay, so as essentially a lance, as a high-speed moving weapon, fine, this is fine. It's durable, it's heavy, it's stiff, it's pointy, it's got a long reach, it's got a lot of the requisite qualities you want of essentially a lance. But in close combat, in a melee, I think you're going to be at a real disadvantage with this type of weapon. Right, now let's actually just step outside for a minute and see how this weapon actually moves around, what I'm able to do with it. Bearing in mind, I'm going to move it more or less how I would usually use a sabre that can cut and thrust. I'm going to slightly ignore the fact that this is a terrible cutter. So as you can see, I really didn't film very much at all. The fact is I did a little bit of swinging around of it before I started filming. And this thing is such an unwieldy beast that trying to do sabre repertoire with this, yes, I could use it perhaps more like a side sword or a messer or something like that, but trying to do sabre repertoire with this, in other words, trying to cut predominantly from the wrist, trying to keep the arm extended out, it's just, as you can hear, I'm out of breath. It is an absolute beast to train with. Maybe I should train with it more actually, because it will certainly make all other sabres feel light afterwards. But it's not just the total weight, it's not the fact that it weighs 3¼ pounds, because that's not that much. The fact is that it's spread over such a long blade, and trying to use something that's essentially the weight of a very large military rapier, trying to use it like a sabre, just doesn't work very well. There's a reason, there's a very good reason that you have different styles of fencing that evolved for different types of swords. And this thing is a beast. And honestly, if I was forced to fight on foot with this, I would indeed use it more like a side sword from wider guards to get more momentum into it. Just trying to use it like an infantry sabre just doesn't work very well at all. And as I said, I really kind of pity any of the French Cuirassiers that got into close melee against people using 1796 sabres or palashes, because they're just much more nimble swords. Not only because they're lighter, and they are lighter, they're like a pound lighter, they're 2 pounds and this is over 3 pounds, but because of course the weight is distributed over a shorter lever as well, and that's really part of the problem. It's not the total weight of this, it's the fact that it's so long and so cumbersome. I was also very conscious of trying not to hit the ground with it as well. It's a very long blade, and when you're moving in circular moulinets, for example, it just doesn't work very well with a blade this long. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting, and I'll see you folks for the next video, and I'll probably talk some more about this sword, and maybe let's do a comparison between this and the 1908, which sometimes people compare the two. Cheers for watching, see you soon, bye! Thanks for watching, please subscribe, we have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.